Bandele Books presents A Servant's Work, Book 2 of the Lost Tales from Esowon series, written by Matthew Chatman, edited by Antoine Bandele, read for you by John Rogers. One day, I came across a trader from the east, a Junga monk, who spoke about enlightenment and heightened senses and all that. So, I disguised myself as a devotee, spent the better part of a year apprentice to him until the day I was kicked out. One of the monks told me that my intentions were not genuine, which was true. I followed the code, said all the words, but there was a darkness in me they could sense, an eagerness. I only sought enlightenment for my own betterment, not to get closer to the Supreme One. Excerpt from the Kishi. Prologue. To climb a mountain is to be reborn. The act changes all men. No matter where he comes from or where he's going, no other trial requires more from the wanderer, and no other journey may offer more in return. But some gifts can never be taken. Some can only be shared. If he is lucky, upon reaching the summit, an extraordinary sense of pride takes hold, and a strange and intoxicating power surges through the climber. If he has suffered injury along the way, then he has emerged stronger. If he has reached the finish without tribulation, then he has outwitted or else asserted his will over nature. He may have arrived sure-footed, straight-backed and proud, or broken and bent, hunched over, and crawling on dusted knees. No matter the case, he has earned the right to laugh in the wicked face of fate, and to weep in the warm grasp of destiny's hand. The mountain cannot bend, and will never bow. Yet the mountain will honor the climber all the same. It has surrendered its secrets and offered up keys to gated mysteries the wanderer could never have imagined from the base. A tired and aching heart shall ease to tap to the beat of triumphant fanfare. Haggard lungs cease to draw ragged breaths, and cool, clean, soothing air brings forth a new, sweet sensation. For the first time since the start of his journey, the wanderer no longer needs to cling desperately to life. He is finally able to embrace it. The dose of perspective completes the act of transformation that began at the ascension. Only from the peak can he see the valley beneath in all its splendor. The wanderer feasts famished eyes on the world around him and the past behind. From his vantage point, everything, even himself, seems smaller and more widely spread, and yet somehow grander than before. Food is more satisfying here. Water tastes sweeter. For a fleeting moment, the man stands as conqueror, lover, sun, and air to all the mountain surveys. He, like the ancient rocky mound he stands on, has risen above all. Together they are masters of the past and stewards of the present, champion and witness. As one, the pair turns their gaze to the unknowable and infinitely possible future. How has the climb changed him? Where will his journey take him from here? If he is lucky, he will descend from the summit safely, with face forward, and walk all other roads in good fortune. When he feels uncertain, and he will if he is wise, he will remember the clarity cast in the pure light of every summit sunrise. When glimpsed from the peak, such a wondrous sight can impart an arid life with renewed meaning. When summoned from behind lowered eyelids, the mere memory can serve as much a guiding light to a lost soul as a star to a weary wanderer traversing the darkest sea. But Junga is not a mountain like any other. Luck alone is not enough to ferry even the most fortunate through her trials. Her summit's dawn brought with it neither wisdom nor clarity. Junga is no friend to the lost. One. Amana was hard at work. Crouched down on his knees, he scrubbed the floor of the enormous outcropping that served as a courtyard and meditation ground for the elders during the day. He had been here for what felt like an eternity, but the dark sky above meant only a few hours could have passed. Barefoot and naked from the waist up, Amana shivered against the chill of the night air, which burned his lungs as he breathed. The skin of his hands, feet, and knees stung against the harsh ground. He was alone, and apart from the bucket and cart of tools at his side, the circular courtyard was empty. 5 spiraling paths of cobbled stone paved the walkways between 5 carved entrances etched into the mountain on the north end, and a labyrinthine garden to the south. Each cave led to a different level within, each dedicated to a different area of study. It was not necessary to enter the courtyard to traverse from one level to the next, but it was the favored route. The monks regarded crossing its convoluted walkways as symbolic of adhering to the trying paths of Boism themselves. Constructed atop a flat expanse of rocky cliff, the outer courtyard was a place of quiet peace. Save for the sounds of the many crashing waterfalls far off in the distance, the only noises to be heard were Amana's ragged breathing and the scraping and sopping of his brush. Long strands of twisted hair swished as he rocked back and forth. The rhythmic sound of the brush filled his ears, and he had grown groggy. He grunted and scrubbed harder, working himself to a savage pace, but time, in its perverse way, seemed to slow. "How long have I been here now?" Amana wondered as he dunked the brush into the bucket. "How much longer will I have to be?" He was too angry to sleep, and too weary to focus on what he was doing when awake. Every now and then he shook his head or gnashed his teeth to fight off fatigue as the tedium of his task set in. A dismal hour of brushing later, the fight had only grown harder. Aching joints and pain in his shoulders and lower back left his limbs feeling heavy and his movements awkward. By the time another hour had passed, he had begun to entertain the notion he might be on the wrong end of a losing battle. He came to a sudden stop as boredom gave way to true exhaustion, and his languid gaze fell upon the few strands of hair hanging motionless and limp before him. "That's how long I've been here," he thought as he stared at the length of his stray locks. When he had first come here, nearly a year ago, he had sworn to uphold the tenets of Boism. The mountain monks wore their hair in locks, which supposedly granted them power from the old gods. Amana had seen little evidence that the style did anything more than express the monks' lack of vanity. Even so, he had adopted the style himself upon being accepted into their order. Now his own locks were so long he'd dragged a few tips through the soapy water pooled on the stone floor as he worked. He looked up at the perpetually cloudy sky above and thought back to the life he led before he'd come here. Even that first day had felt like the end of a long and arduous journey. At that time, he didn't know much more about the fabled mountain monks than anyone else. He'd heard tell of their legendary self-discipline. He knew they were rumored to possess extraordinary abilities, yet, for pious reasons, refrained from using such powers in their dealings throughout the world. He'd grown up hearing tales from travelers and adventurers who'd claimed to have visited the hallowed rocky terrain the monks called home. They had described it as being majestic as it was mysterious, and the tales called to mind the same images for all of Amana's generation. Great jutting spires of granite and graceful towers of alabaster sprung from the ground like white plants in a golden garden encircled by pillars of marble and ziggurats of limestone. Oases of lush flora dotted the otherwise arid landscape, and here and there blindingly white waterfalls adorned the sheer cliffs feeding tributary rivers that had formed the ancient craggy canyons below. Most curious of all, though, it was said that the summit of the tallest of the Junga Mountains was shrouded in a perpetual cloudy haze. Nobody he had ever met, nor heard of in either story or song, had ever claimed to have seen the top. To hear it from the revered elders themselves, all things were clear when viewed from the peak. Before meeting the monks, he wasn't so sure he believed in all the tales surrounding them, but the grandeur of their stronghold had more than lived up to his expectations. By the time his private pilgrimage had brought him to the base of Mount Junga, he felt he'd be willing to do anything to be welcomed into their ranks. That fateful evening, he had approached a hooded figure kneeling on a stone dais a few meters beyond a jewel-encrusted archway. The moonstones flecked the black stone of the arch with sparkling light that contrasted gently against the sheen of the dark marble. The man looked impossibly old, and his solidly black eyes sparkled with brilliant blue-white light from the stones above. Amana prostrated himself before the Old One, hands turned upward, head bowed. "I am Amana," he had declared, his voice low and deferential. "I hope to apprentice myself to the monks to achieve enlightenment. What would you ask of me?" For a long moment, the man merely stared. Just when Amana was on the verge of repeating himself, the old man turned and walked into the dark gloom. He motioned to Amana, and together they meandered through the mountainous passageway to the great temple above. Eventually, Amana would admit to himself that he'd never have been able to reach the temple on his own. He didn't think of himself as a weak person. On the contrary, his career as a pirate had required great skill in combat and a knack for manipulation and quick thinking. Beyond that, his innate talent to see briefly into the future gave him an edge over most people. But his short sight was less than optimized for the task of climbing Mount Junga. The moment he'd set foot to the cliff-lined pass all those moons ago, he felt his perception had been dimmed in some way. Like the Junga Range itself, peaks and valleys characterized his memory of the journey. His vision had become cloudy and his hearing less acute than it had been before. Though in fine health, he'd felt as though he was suffering from a terrible head cold. His sinuses seemed congested, and his bleary eyes and plugged ears made the mere act of walking difficult. At that time, he had simply thought it to be a result of climbing to such a high peak. But by the second evening, he'd come to accept that some unknown element was at play. Something about this place just wasn't right. That night had been too dark to be natural, and the light of the following day too harsh to believe. On the third morning, they had descended into a rugged canyon scar, and at various times he felt overwhelmed by the constant buzzing noise of swarming insects, though he never saw any. At others, the land seemed so quiet that his footsteps echoed, the only sound for leagues around, even as his guide kept no more than 10 steps ahead. When it all became too confusing, he had demanded an explanation from the guide, only to find his own voice inaudible. He'd tried screaming a second time, only to experience the same effect. It was like shouting to be heard above the high winds and crashing rain of a non-existent storm. The higher they climbed, the less Amana could see before him. Unable to see past his nose due to the ever-present opaque mist that surrounded them both, and unaccustomed to the eerie quiet of the night, he found himself easily disoriented. 4 days into the long trek, he lost a great deal of his strength. He was provided with no food and drank only what little water he came across in the wild. As he sat resting one day, he realized that he could no longer safely turn back, even if he wanted to. Not only was he sure to lose his way in the unnatural Junga mists, he didn't think he'd have the strength to complete the journey. At that point, he had been wholly in the hands of his guide, who never spoke to him throughout the entire journey, and only stopped on those few occasions when Amana insisted upon rest. Finally, on the 5th morning of their climb, Amana had been rewarded with his first vision of the Great Temple. The massive structure had been built so as to appear as an extension of the tallest Junga mountain. Parts of it seemed to run underground through subterranean trails or deep into painstakingly carved corridors that ran directly into the mountain itself. Large patches of the wall were covered by natural rock formations and overgrown vines. True to the stories he'd heard as a child, the mountain's peak and even the temple's uppermost level were hidden by an obtrusive layer of fog. After signaling him to stop, his guide had proceeded on his own up a wide stairway leading to a small antechamber into the ornate temple, leaving Amana at the steps outside. Weak with hunger and parched with thirst, he desperately wanted to collapse then and there, but his instinct had told him to remain standing for the first moment the monks laid eyes on him. 4 monks descended from the temple above. The first, his guide, proceeded down the steps at the same steady pace he'd carried throughout the climb, and he walked straight past Amana without a glance in his direction, seemingly returning to his vigil at the mountain's base. The 3 remaining figures stood motionless at the top of the steps for a long moment. Eventually, Amana assumed they were waiting for him to approach them, so he did. "Masters," he called in a voice weak with thirst and exhaustion. "My name is Amana. I have journeyed far to apprentice myself to you." The youngest, tallest, and broadest of the 3 spoke first. He took a step forward, and in a voice as deep and calm as the sea itself, he asked, "Tell me, Amana,
what is it that you seek?
I seek enlightenment, Amana cried with as much emotion as he could summon. He wanted the power the monks had, a power that would allow him to achieve vengeance. Recently, my life seems to have lost all meaning. I've come in search of a new one. Teach me your ways. He had rehearsed the words several times in his head during his ascent. He could only hope his words sounded genuine enough. The tall man considered him for a moment. He cast a sidelong glance to the others, who both stepped forward to join him.
I am Vivek,
he said before motioning to his companions.
And these are my fellows, Shekar and Lata.
Amana bowed slightly to each as Vivek continued.
There is no founder of our way, and no single teaching. Truth can only be known through Allah's balance.
Light-headed and starving, Amana swayed slightly on his feet. Tell me, please, what must I do to achieve balance? Shekar, the thinner, hunchbacked monk to the right, spoke with a hoarse voice, little more than a whisper.
What do you know of Allah?
Amana did not believe he knew the name. He had heard many superstitious tales throughout his travels, with sailors and adventurers. There were so many old gods, hundreds, but something whispered at the back of his mind. The god of balance. The god of scales, he murmured.
Clear your mind,
Shekar said quietly.
Open your heart. You must learn to walk in step with Allah, as we do.
The monk who stood in the middle, a short woman, far older than the others, looked Amana up and down before bringing her gentle eyes to rest on his own. She was barefoot like her fellows and wore loose-fitting robes accompanied by shawls of purple and white. Her back was strong and her posture straight. She wore no jewelry, but carried a staff taller than she was, which she held in a firm grip, but did not seem to actually need. Amana wondered if it was one of the magical staves of legend. He had thought they were all relegated to mystic soldiers in the great armies, not to a lone monk on an isolated mountain peak. Amana couldn't tear his eyes away from it. They were quite valuable in the Sapphire Isles. The woman's grizzled mane of matted gray hair must have been at least twice as long as she was tall, and it lay splayed haphazardly on the ground behind her. Her toothless mouth opened, and a thin, reedy voice said,
You have come this far along the Junga Trail. Though paths before you will not always be clear, as you must already know. But take heed. You must never give in to despair, as each day is obscured by the dark of night. Night must yield to the light of day. All things are clear from the peak of Mount Junga. To stand there, Allah must stand beside you.
I will do whatever you ask of me. Amana kneeled before them and bowed his head. Anything that would give him their elusive power. I am at your command.
We issue no commands here,
Vivek proclaimed in a stern voice. Lata followed him with her softer rasp.
Remember, there are many paths to truth. Do as you are asked, and we shall guide you on the path we follow.
Amana's eyes burned as beads of sweat trickled down his brow. He blinked through the stinging as his thoughts returned to the present. Standing, he started down the courtyard paths as the pain in his joints subsided. Anger and frustration were getting the better of him. He needed to move through this. As he walked, he thought about how much time he'd wasted over the last year, and his footfalls grew heavier, his mind sagging with weariness. He ceased his pacing at the center of the paths and sank to the floor in a meditative position. No matter what he looked at, and no matter how he tried to forget, scattered memories of the past year danced before him. Fine then. If I can't stop thinking about it, then let's think about it. He closed his eyes and he cast his thoughts back to the beginning, sinking into the source of his frustration. Two. After his first meeting with the monks, Amana had been permitted to eat, drink, and bathe. He was shown to a small room where he collapsed onto a simple cot. He couldn't say how long he slept there, perhaps a day, perhaps a week. When he finally woke, he listened to his new instructors speak at length about what he must do to conform to life in the temple. Amana took up their traditional style of dress of simple robes. He had agreed to abstain from stealing and other wrongdoings. He had given up his belongings, that much had all been easy enough. But untethering himself from worldly concerns, as the monks professed to do, meant more than merely surrendering possessions. To join their ranks, Amana had also taken up a vow of celibacy, albeit with a distinct lack of enthusiasm. He had no intention of going back on his word, if only because he couldn't see any reason why he should, not now that his wife Asha was gone. And so his work began. In the beginning, he'd agreed to do only as he was told. He had no problem submitting himself before the wisdom of the elders if it meant learning from them. But for those first few weeks, they asked him to simply sweep the halls surrounding the monastery's inner sanctum at the lowest level. So as not to be disruptive, all work that took place in the corridors throughout every tier of the temple had to be performed in silence. Those initial days had seemed to snail by at a mercilessly slow pace. Amana was then tasked with assisting in the dipping of candles in the cellars. Tutored at first by Vivek, he was left to continue the job without the monk's assistance after a few hours. The monk continued to survey his handiwork every now and then throughout the following days. After that point, he had been permitted to work alongside an even younger apprentice named Avishal, with whom he'd been allowed to converse as they worked. Soft-spoken and friendly, Avishal was thin and carried out his duties with a quiet enthusiasm. After a few days of working together, Amana found that Avishal had been with the monks for several years, but for some strange reason, the young man had never ascended to the floors above. Avishal had never learned of the greater mysteries the monks had to teach, nor did he profess any desire to. When pressed about how this had come to pass, Avishal's answer was always the same. I came from a land torn by war. I came here hoping to find my place in the world, and I succeeded. Stories like these were fairly common among the other apprentices with whom Amana had grown familiar. Few of the monks spoke with him, though as far as he could tell they didn't seem to speak amongst themselves very often either. Not openly, at any rate. Amana wasn't sure what had curbed the ambitions of so many of his cohorts. Perhaps they were just too easily satisfied. Shelter, a hot meal, dignified labor, these were enough for some. Then there were those who had come in search of a new beginning. Many, like himself, had been the victims of old traumas, and perhaps even a few were guilty of dealing out undue trauma to others. These were people hoping to forget what the past had brought to them, or to be forgiven for that which they carried within. And there were those like Avishal, who had come from nothing, hoping to discover themselves. Amana stood apart from them all. He knew who he was, and he wasn't running away from his past. He was here to take hold of his future. Amana hadn't been able to see how making candles would lead him to a greater understanding of his innate powers, and so he thought the monks must have had some other reason for instructing him to mold the waxy sticks. Frankly, he hadn't even seen what it might have to do with their own professed beliefs or codes of behavior. He supposed it was a job that needed doing, and the monks probably felt that such menial tasks belonged to those at the lowest level of study. Amana, still eager to please at that early stage of his apprenticeship, had simply shrugged it off and gotten on with it. He tried to think of the work as its own reward, and felt somehow, even without calling upon his gift of short sight, that great things would come to him if he stayed on the path the monks had set before him. The task required a certain measure of patience and skill, and so he performed without complaint. A moon later, after ascending to the second floor within the mountain, he began to work in the kitchens. This exercise had, in a way, seemed even less instructive to him than the first, but he'd been excited to have reached the next level so quickly. Looking back on it now, it was easily his favorite period of service. The tasks of the day varied wildly, and the busy hours made the days roll by quickly. At times, he wondered where the monks came by their stores of food. He supposed the monks grew their own fruits and vegetables, but the rest remained a mystery. After several weeks, he'd reached the third level within the mountain, where closets full of cleaning utensils flanked his new living space. For 3 miserable moons he'd polished furniture and windows all throughout the temple and the cavernous mountain halls. He performed these tasks well, sometimes under the watchful eye of an elder, though just as often on his own, carrying on without complaint. But where grit and determination had once gleamed in his dark eyes, now a deep-seated and smoking rage smoldered behind them. One morning, as Amana sat cleaning while Vivek observed from behind, he had allowed his anger to boil over for the first time since arriving at Mount Junga. As he stared at his own image in the copper pot he'd been polishing, he'd had time to reflect on how he had felt bored, confused, and even wasted since being welcomed into the temple. Until reaching this level, however, he could at the least say he had never felt insulted. Trying to ignore Vivek's presence was like trying not to notice a foul smell in the air. Although both had been cordial enough since they had met, there was always a certain rigidity to their interactions. Amana couldn't say precisely why, but of the 3 elders who had greeted him when he had first arrived at the monastery, Vivek was the only one he disliked. Though Amana had never spoken openly of this to anybody, he had the distinct impression the feeling was mutual. There was little Vivek did not see. His roving eyes took in the full measure of everything and everyone he saw, a teacher's gaze. Amana made a point of keeping his back to the monk to avoid it.
You have something you'd like to discuss, apprentice,
Vivek said without making it a question.
You think this desk beneath you,
he continued before Amana had time to summon a proper retort. No, not exactly, Amana said resentfully. It's just pointless. Vivek raised an eyebrow.
You think so?
Well, Amana considered his words as though giving great thought to the matter. You can make something shine without tarnishing something else. How's that for a little Junga wisdom? He thought to himself.
Do you value your cleaning rags so highly?
Vivek asked coolly. Amana snorted quietly at the stupidity of the question. He quickened the pace of his polishing, trying once more to put Vivek's presence out of his mind. As if in direct response, the monk continued talking, straining Amana's patience even further.
Have I ever told you about Uzoma?
Vivek inquired. Amana rolled his eyes as he went about his work. Not another fable. You've mentioned a failed apprentice before. The lost one, I think you called him.
Uzoma was talented when he came to us, just as you are,
Vivek said, gazing out of the room's lone window.
But he was also brash, willful, and worst of all, impatient. Again, like you.
Amana took a moment to examine his handiwork before answering. I'm not sure you intended it, but that's the closest you've come to paying me a compliment.
Perhaps you think I'm out to get you, that I want to see you fail,
Vivek suggested thoughtfully.
This is not so.
Amana said nothing, but the scowl he wore intensified. The monk's words did nothing to ease the sense of doubt he hadn't realized until now he'd been feeling.
Uzoma showed great promise,
Vivek said, taking a few paces forward. Amana still refused to face the monk directly, but the older man's voice grew louder as he moved closer.
He had extraordinary powers of his own. I knew from our first meeting he had the potential to stand as one of the greatest among us, given time. Before apprenticing himself here at Mount Junga, he even saved my life,
Vivek finished solemnly. What happened to him? Where is he now? Amana asked, more to fill the silence than anything else. He didn't truly care about the answer. All he wanted was for Vivek to go away. Vivek sighed heavily.
The road to truth is a winding and treacherous path. Some of us lose our way. One must be strong and righteous. Uzoma had strength in abundance, but strength alone is not enough. Our paths were paved by self-assurance and discipline, not certainty and arrogance. Uzoma outgrew us. We were wasting his time. He had better things to do.
In spite of himself, Amana couldn't suppress a feeling of sympathy for the lost one now that he knew firsthand how the monks went about teaching.
You seem troubled, apprentice,
Vivek remarked, his voice calm and matter-of-fact.
May I ask why?
If you have to ask, then you probably wouldn't understand, Amana said, without facing him. In the vase's reflection, he saw Vivek brush a small fleck of dust from a cabinet.
Perhaps I'm less interested in what I can see than I am in what you have to say,
Vivek countered, his voice still maddeningly calm. And what if I haven't got anything to say? Amana asked, almost turning in his frustration, but catching himself at the last second.
But you already have.
Amana swung around to glare at the monk, only to find the corridor empty. For several hours, he thought his outburst might have gone too far, and that the monks would ask him to leave. But nothing out of the ordinary happened over the next hours, and so he'd return to business as usual the following day. Several weeks of buffing and shining later, he'd been escorted by Shikar to the 4th level within the mountain. There, he had pushed carts of books and delivered scrolled messages all around this floor and that, the chambers of which were otherwise reserved for monks who had mastered their studies. Masters greeted him at the beginning of each day and thanked him at the end, but never conducted business in front of him, nor offered anything in the way of conversation or tutelage. When they required privacy for meetings, they dismissed him from their presence, and he would instead tend to the hearths that warmed the communal hall, send orders to the kitchens below, or replace burned candles throughout the many meditation rooms. While on a candle run to the cellars one day, he'd said, "Ah, well," to Avishal, who looked as though he hadn't moved since Amana left him in the cellars. "At least now I get to play with fire every once in a while. Adds a touch of danger. Ya, Kijana?" Avishal didn't respond, like always, continuing his own work silence. Amana thought using the more casual island slang would stir the young man, but it did nothing for him at all. As he prepared a cart loaded with logs shortly before the next morning's dawn, he rounded a corner only to run into Shikar, who was accompanied by Vivek. Without a word, the younger monk had taken hold of the cart and continued up the hall while Shikar led Amana to the 5th level. As they walked, Amana reined in the impatience he felt and asked the old master what he had in store for him today. Steeling himself for whatever dreary chore was in store for him, he glanced sideways to catch Shikar's eye as they climbed another set of stairs together. "Today," Shikar said quietly, a knowing glint in his eye, "we are going to play with fire." Mouth agape, and paralyzed by shock and regret, Amana stopped dead in his tracks, though Shikar continued forward. After a moment or two, Amana simply shook his head and smiled in nervous disbelief as he jogged to catch up. His euphoria was almost palpable. They had accepted him to the upper echelon of the temple. Finally, he was going to learn the mystic arts from a master. Finally, he would take a step closer to achieving the power he truly desired. Three.
Brewing tea is a delicate art,
Shikar said an hour later to a sour-faced Amana. The younger man stoked a small fire beneath the kettle between them. A fresh wave of disappointment had sapped Amana of the vitality he'd felt during their long walk to Shikar's room on the 5th floor of the temple. Familiar frustrations were bubbling back up to the surface of his temper, ever strained these days. "Really, you should have expected something like this. It's your own fault for getting your hopes up." Shikar crumbled what looked like a small white pebble into a green jug filled with water. He stirred without offering an explanation for his actions before lifting the lid of the teapot to peek at the simmering contents.
"The flames are too high,"
Shikar said gently. He pulled a small pouch from inside his sleeves and sprinkled dried red-orange leaves into the pot. They glowed like the flyaway embers of a campfire. Shikar went into the process of steeping the tea away from direct heat. Once that step was complete, they would then drain the liquid from the pot, leaving only the dregs, at which point the pot would be filled again with cool, clean water and returned to the fire. Lost in a kind of stupor, Amana was paying more attention to the ugly furnishings around them than he was to Shikar. He rearranged a bit of kindling as the two knelt on the purple mats of Shikar's chamber. Shadows cast from the flames danced in a flicker over garish green carpeting and pale orange walls. As the old monk went on, Amana honed in on the sounds of chirping birds. Their song carried through an open diamond-shaped window. The small patch of clear blue sky he glimpsed far off in the distance was the nearest source of beauty. Shikar shuffled off to a corner of the room. Amana had his back to him as he poked at the embers, but he heard the clinking of porcelain and the heavy thunk of wood as Shakar rummaged through a cabinet in the corner behind him. When the elder returned, he was carrying a large tray bearing 2 empty cups, a bowl of water, and a large black basin covered by a fine mesh strainer. Amana watched as Shakar took another small white pebble from the jar he had pulled from an inner pocket of his robes. Shakar held the stone between his thumb and forefinger and examined it for a moment before dropping it into a mortar and crushing it with a pestle. He added the powder to the bowl of water, which he swirled gently with his hand until the whatever it was dissolved. He dipped his fingers into the water and coated the backs of his hands and knuckles before motioning for Amana to do the same. Shakar poured a cup of tea for each of them.
Have you ever heard of the Pelepe plant, Amana?
Amana thought back to rumors he'd heard during his former life, dredging up memories of tales passed around by pirates and tradesmen. Fairly inexpensive, prized for its brilliant orange blossoms, he said as he accepted the cup. I've heard it called the forest's fire. I've never heard of it being used in preparing tea before, though. It's not an especially rare plant, is it? Or is this some sort of secret recipe?
The Pelepe leaf is easily acquired, Shakar admitted, but the skill to brew tea with it is not, poisonous as it is.
Hoping he had misheard what Shakar had said, Amana said nothing and simply stared at the old man, as though imploring him to start making sense.
What is it that we do here?
Shakar asked suddenly as he clasped his hands together. Amana blinked in confusion at the sudden change of subject. He felt unsure how to answer. Even after all these moons, he had no earthly idea what the masters did behind closed doors. A part of him wanted to scream as much in the elder's wrinkled face. Was he about to be chastised for not having caught on to some hidden meaning the monks were able to divine in the dusting of shelves? Or perhaps he was about to be presented with a charming anecdote concerning the quiet dignity of the emptying of chamber pots. Maybe another tale of a lost student. With a considerable effort, he quelled the impulse to rage at the elder monk. As unfair as he thought it was to be tested with these probing questions after having been taught nothing, he felt certain the elder would expect a proper answer. Even an incorrect guess would probably be taken as Amana having invested some thought into the matter. He didn't want the monks to think of him as a quitter who had just thrown his hands up in frustration. He very nearly had, of course, but that didn't mean he wanted to be thought of that way. So, he appraised the old man as he took his own steaming cup of tea in hand and said what he assumed the elder wanted to hear. "We toil here in an effort to master ourselves," Amana said evenly.
Why?
asked the elder in a bald voice. Amana went on, speaking with more confidence than he truly felt. "To achieve control over the body and mind.
Why?
Great discipline is required to study the 5 paths."
And why do we study the 5 paths?
To achieve enlightenment. To have Nkarala return us to true balance, Amana stated without any real conviction. Privately, he thought the platitudes had sounded nice enough as he'd said them, but a part of him regretted just how hollow the recitation had felt. The words tasted soulless on his tongue, and it had taken effort not to spit them out. He'd been quoting the monks themselves, but had discovered neither falsehood nor truth in their mantras throughout his time in the temple. Shakar fixed Amana with a challenging look, which gave him the distinct impression the elder knew exactly what was going on in the younger man's mind. Amana felt his chest tighten uncomfortably, but he fought to restrain any additional physical clues that might hint at his defensive mood.
What is true balance?
Shakar asked patiently, his voice as soft as his face was hard. Amana shook his head slightly. He had expected the question, but something about the way the monk had asked it disarmed him. The mounting anger and stress he felt waned, and he looked back to the window as though hoping to find the answer floating in the sky above. After a long moment, he said, "I've come here in search of true balance. I'm afraid I can't say what it is, exactly. I've never felt it before."
If true, this poses an interesting question for you.
Shakar paused for an instant before saying,
"If you don't know how to recognize balance, how will you know once you found it? More than that, if you don't know what it is, how do you know it is what you want?"
Frustrated by this stupid game, Amana glared at Shakar and allowed a long moment of silence to pass between them. Wanting to simply stop this inane conversation, he ignored the question and asked one of his own. Could you not have brewed this tea without me? He demanded, his voice deeper and more aggressive than it had been before. Shakar raised an incredulous and incredibly bushy eyebrow as he spoke.
Of course I could have.
Is it necessary for me to drink the Pelepe to achieve enlightenment, or to know true balance? Amana asked brusquely.
No, I don't suppose it is.
Emboldened, Amana went on. Well, if you don't need my help making tea, and I don't need to drink it, then why am I here? Shakar closed his eyes, drained his cup, and set it on the ground before answering.
I don't believe I've ever encountered a cup of tea that I needed to drink. But I can say with certainty I've never encountered a cup of tea that I regretted drinking.
His half-lidded dark eyes found Amana's fierce brown ones.
Can you say the same?
Amana attempted to hold his gaze as he sipped his own tea, but as soon as he took his first swallow, the effort grew suddenly taxing, and he felt his eyes begin to droop. His head felt too heavy and began to loll, rolling to either side of his neck. He slumped forward a little, his shoulders slouched, and his mind went dull. He struggled to stay lucid, but he didn't think he could. He tried looking to the window again. He strained for the sounds of the singing birds, but their song grew distant and faint, replaced by a rush of blood flowing through his veins and the beat of his own heart pounding in his ears. He tried yelling for help, but his voice died away in his throat. He had killed it. He didn't need help. No, he didn't want it. This was amazing. This was fantastic. The world seemed to fall away from him, and for a moment that might have been an eternity, time seemed to stand still. Tastes he enjoyed danced across his tongue. A pleasant tingling sensation tickled his fingers and licked at his toes. Aromas he'd half forgotten filled his nose, and memories he'd thought dead and gone resurfaced. The smell of fresh bread baking from his childhood brought a smile to his face, only to be replaced by something else. It took a long moment for him to identify what it was, but when he did, his smile drooped momentarily and emerged wider and grander than before. It was perfume. The lingering scent of perfume trapped in Asha's hair. The delicate laughter of his daughter, Sana, telling a joke. A feeling of sublime contentment stole over him, and he felt for a moment as he had years ago, when times were good, before he had lost Asha and Sana, before they had been taken from him. He inhaled deeply to take in the scent again. It was a spicy sweetness he had often smelled before sleeping at night, and while waking in the morning, sometimes before even opening his eyes. Now, he opened eyes he didn't remember closing. As quickly as it had come, the sensation washed away. Awestruck, he stared from the cup in his hand to the monk sitting across from him. Nearly overcome with emotion, he took a moment to center himself. "What?" he began in a stammering voice. "What is this stuff?" Shakar surveyed him with a strange look on his face. It struck Amana as a bizarre combination of satisfaction and pity, and he wasn't sure what to make of it. He raised his cup to take a second drink. Before the cup had reached his lips, however, the old monk bounded forward and with improbable strength and speed caught Amana's arm in a binding grapple. Shakar jammed his left thumb into Amana's wrist. His hand pinned between the elder's thumb and fingers, Amana's grip was forced to slacken, and with a twist of Shakar's other hand, he freed the cup from Amana's limp grasp. Surprised by the unexpected action, the younger man kept his seat as the elder vaulted away from him. For an instant, flowing robes, beaded necklaces, and twisted hair seemed to fill the tiny room. Coming to a momentum-defying yet graceful halt, Shakar resumed his stooped position on the mat opposite Amana. The entire exercise had taken no more than a few seconds from start to finish, and despite the blinding speed with which the elder had moved, he'd spilled not a drop of the Pelepe. "Why did you do that?" Amana asked. "I was only—"
"The Pelepe leaf requires great care to handle properly,"
Shakar interrupted in his hoarse bark of a voice.
"If brewed for too short a time, or at too high a temperature, the tea becomes mildly toxic and leaves an unpleasant itching in the throat. If left to stew for too long, the tannins in the tea impart a sickening, astringent flavor, so potent it may induce nausea."
He looked hard at Amana before continuing.
"If brewed to perfection, as this pot has been, the tea produced sends the uninitiated into transports of euphoria, a first taste of what it means to be free. The tea relaxes your physical form, but until you learn to sever the link between your painful memories and your heightened state of mind, you will never truly stand on your own. You must detach yourself from your pain, reacquaint yourself with pleasure. Until you have, you shall never know inner peace.
Amana gave a kind of start as he came back into his right mind. It took a moment longer for Shakar's words to sink in.
One day, should you achieve true balance, you may join me in a second cup of Pelepe, Shakar said. For now, you must abstain. The tea is the only variety those who live at the peak ever drink. You will learn to brew the Pelepe leaf, and to do the thing properly in service to the elders. Take heed, this is no easy task. Do not be surprised if I, or one of my fellows, rejects your first, second, third, or even 100th cup. Accustomed to dealing with pain we may be, but we don't much relish needless suffering.
Amana had been listening as attentively as he could, but all the while, as the elder had spoken, he hadn't been able to tear his eyes away from the cup in the old man's hand. The monk noticed his gaze and lowered his voice to a cautious whisper.
And as you work, ponder this, young one. Lasting happiness is not to be found in the bottom of a Pelepe cup. All you shall find there are the dregs of a bitter life.
What do you find in the bottom of yours, master? Amana asked in genuine curiosity.
Only the soggy remains of what had been a very fine cup of tea,
Shakar said, pouring another for himself. 4. Amana woke from his meditation in a cold sweat, remembering Shakar's words. He surveyed the scrubbed courtyard and judged his work complete. Just in time, too, he said to himself as the sky began to lighten. Mere weeks after having learned to brew the Pelepe, he'd been sent from the 5th level within the temple all the way back down to the ground floor for his final tasks. As had been the case every other time he'd moved from one rung within the mountain to the next, he hadn't been told precisely what to expect. But he knew whom he was scheduled to meet with and when. The sun rose high in the sky above, and he was due to meet with Lata. She had mentored him for the last moon, instructing him in the mixing of various herbs and other ingredients. Together, the pair had produced a variety of restorative potions, healing salves, and other balms. The diminutive master spent nearly all of her time working in the gardens, and she had instructed Amana to clean the courtyard the previous evening. Afterward, she had excused herself to a meeting between the other elders which Amana suspected concerned him. Finally, the moment he'd been waiting for had arrived. Rejuvenated somewhat by his long moment of rest and invigorated by the prospect of the new day, Amana returned to the center of the courtyard where he had left his cart of cleaning supplies. He laid his tools in a wooden storage chest near the entrance to the gardens on the south end of the circular meditation ground. He retrieved a large sack he'd left at the bottom of the chest before washing his hands, feet, and face in the crystal-clear waters of a small fountain carved in the shape of a tiger's head. He pulled on a set of fresh robes from the sack, then walked through the easternmost pathway that led to the topiary maze. He wanted to be early for his meeting at the center of the garden. As he walked, he felt almost giddy with excitement. The frustration he'd felt throughout his long night of toil had evaporated with the break of day. Today marked the 1-year anniversary of his acceptance into the monastery. His anger and humiliation at the thought of having to return to the lowest level of the temple had consumed his thoughts over the course of the last week. But when the monks had told him that his final test would soon be upon him, his spirits had lifted somewhat, only to have been dragged back down under the sagging weight of anticipation. Now he walked with a sense of purpose, his path illuminated by the light of possibility. At last he would apprentice himself before the monks directly. To his surprise, Lata was already hard at work in the center of the garden when he arrived. "Have you been here all night?" he asked as a greeting. Stooping slightly as she worked, she turned away from a willowy bush dotted with vibrant yellow flower buds she had been pruning before his arrival. Her face was impassive, but her eyes shone with light and warmth.
"Sleep loses its luster once you've reached the peak, Amana," she said in answer. "My plants need me more than I need rest."
She bent to take hold of a gnarled bramble as long and unruly as her hair that had wrapped itself around the bottommost stalks of the bush. Using her bare and scarred hands, she gripped the thorny weed firmly, and her face remained stoic as she attempted to untangle the wild mess. Amana stepped forward to her aid, but she waved him off and continued on her own. He watched closely as she went on, noting how careful she was being not to harm either plant as she worked. Dark drops of blood leaked from the palms of her leathery hands and trailed down the length of her forearms to drip from bony elbows, but her grip remained firm. "Why not just uproot the weeds?" Amana asked, staring at the spots on the ground where blood had fallen. As she finished, she straightened her back to stand to her full height. The difference it made for one so short was surprising, and she turned to look him full in the face.
Uprooting is a last resort, a road to be traveled only when all others are closed to me.
Amana flicked a dismissive hand. But it's only a weed." Some of the light in her eyes faded away, and she cocked her head, regarding him as though she wasn't quite sure what he was. He pointed to her hands, his next words more gentle. "It would spare you a great deal of time and pain." Lotta dipped her hands into a basin of water.
Pain is an old acquaintance of mine, and he knows his place. All living things deserve to thrive for as long as they can, whether the ugly weed or the pretty flower. If one threatens another and can be coaxed, groomed, or separated, rather than destroyed, then that would be my preference.
"But it's a weed. It's not in its nature to mind its place or to stop growing. No matter what you do, it will threaten your other plants eventually," Amana warned.
That may be,
Lotta bandaged her cleaned hands with silken wrappings.
but one needn't surrender to nature to live in harmony with it.
Amana smiled inwardly and watched as she dotted around the garden, fetching a couple of water skins for the pair of them. A moon ago, when he'd been sent from the 5th floor all the way back down to the bottom of the temple, he'd been in a towering temper. He'd been so close. Why had they sent him back to where he'd started? What had he done to warrant such punishment? But Lotta's exercises had been highly educational, and her manner less terse than Vivek's, her disposition easier to read than Shikar's. Amana thought her more affable, and somehow even more human than her fellows. She had, on occasion, remarked at the great size of many of the plants she looked after while in Amana's presence. Over time, he'd grown to suspect the meaning behind the poetry through which she described the little world she presided over. It was peopled by seedlings and saplings that might one day grow tall and mighty under her guidance. Perhaps, Amana thought, that was why the monks had sent him back down to the lowest level for his final test, to remind him of his progress, to show him how far he had come. Out of respect for Lotta, Amana restrained himself from asking about when he would return to the peak to continue his training. After a time, however, his anticipation must have shown on his face. She looked at him pityingly before taking his hand.
I have something to show you,
she whispered as she led him to a portion of the garden he'd never seen before. She led him through a vine-covered archway to a grassy walkway darkened by hedged thickets. The way ahead was so dimly lit that even though the sun had now fully risen, the path was only barely visible. After a short walk, they reached a large clearing where Amana could see a steady stream of clearest water trickling from a fountain to a planter, from which sprouted the most beautiful flower he had ever seen. A large blossom of softly shimmering white that glowed as brilliantly as the new moon.
It is called Aya's Grace,
Lotta said, pointing to the fountain.
A particularly thirsty plant, but a picky one. Here, take one of these and crumble it into the fountain.
The old woman pulled a white pellet from a pouch on her waist, holding it up for Amana to see. I've seen these before, Amana exclaimed, when Shikar taught me to brew pellepiti.
Yes, we craft them here using ancient techniques,
Lotta nodded.
The powder they break down into settles at the base of the vessel, attracting even the most minute impurities and repelling the water itself. Watch as it swells.
Sure enough, cold, clear water bubbled up and over to drain into the planter, which Amana now realized held no soil. How does the plant survive like this? He asked in wonder.
It is dull-witted as plants go, she said.
He gave her a questioning look, wondering whether she was joking or not, before she continued in a solemn voice.
Who knows what chain of circumstances gave rise to the plant? But it is descended from the old world. In times gone by, the flower was common, proud and strong. Perhaps the air today is drier than it once was. Perhaps the soil is not as vital as it used to be. Or maybe something other than water rained down from the ancient skies. I cannot say. I was not there.
She rested her hands near the base of the large clay pot from which the flower sprang.
When planted using normal means, Aya's grace becomes either infirm or gluttonous, Lotta said patiently. When planted in soil, it drinks too quickly. The flower becomes too strong for its own good and finds itself overgrown. In an effort to balance the scales, the plant will take in water to filter its inner passages. It does this too quickly also and becomes engorged. Pathways saturated, darkened, and clogged. It begins to die. Only by using the purest waters and supplying a carefully apportioned blend of minerals shall the plant flourish and shine.
Marveling at the thought of such a laborious and unending chore, Amana brought the palms of his own hands to rest against the pot. "It must have great powers for you to look after it like this," he said, speaking more to himself. "But I don't understand. Why not let it die?" She looked at him before saying,
"If left on its own, the plant would already be extinct. This was the last of its kind in the world when I brought it here. That is the way of nature. But look."
She pointed to 2 new bulbs lower on the stalk.
"New beginnings." She smiled up at him. "When the time for death has come, we accept it. Death is a part of life, but as long as we are here, as long as we can help, we will. Ask for help. Learn to accept it. Encourage 3 others to do the same, and encourage them to encourage 3 more. Watch as your light spreads."
Conflicted thoughts raced through Amana's mind and pierced through the flower's calming glow. Had the plant asked for help? Could it have refused aid once it was offered? People were more complicated than that. Some did not know how or when to accept help. Others did not know when they needed it. And more than a few, Amana knew, were beyond help of any kind. Some simply weren't worth such trouble. Some weren't even worth the effort it took to keep Aya's grace alive, but Lotta would not want to hear that. "A candle lighting another," he said, nodding his head, slowly. "Why wait until today to tell me all this, Master? Does this have anything to do with my final test?"
"I don't know so much about final tests."
Her lips formed a tender smile.
"I find it impossible to stop learning myself."
Amana weathered the gentle rebuke in silence, and tried to look as though he found her remark amusing.
"Go and rest now," she said. "We will speak to you this evening. Come to the chamber of the elders at dusk. Bring an open heart and a steady mind. The next leg of your journey begins tonight."
Yes, finally, he thought as he turned to head back to his humble living quarters. He was truly on his way. He allowed the anger and frustration he'd been feeling to fully slip away from him at last. A year ago, he'd been a desperate wanderer. Now he was on the verge of mastering destiny itself. The power to seize the future would soon belong to him. Amana had known he was ready for so long, and now the monks knew it too. He was standing on the precipice of a new era. He was about to cross the bridge between today and tomorrow. A great change was upon him. This final test of dedication would mark his passage to the summit. At last he would see the peak and unlock its mysteries. After today, all of his hard work would be worth it. "5. The soft light of dusk bathed the lower levels of the temple. Dark clouds drifted across a gleaming sky of purple and orange. And as the sun set, Amana's spirit soared with him as he trotted up the steps to the peak. He retraced a familiar path through a tall windowless tower which housed the spiraling set of stairs to the 5th floor. It was a very long walk in the dark, and he was climbing higher than ever before. When he had learned to brew Pelepé tea, He had been largely confined to the meditation chambers that made up most of the 5th level. Tonight he was bound for the room above all others. What would he learn? Would he finally be able to see far enough into the future to kill? No, he couldn't think that way around the monks. They would know his true intentions. They had a way of looking straight through his lies and half-truths. He only needed to keep his face a little while longer. Then he could get back to his real business. A year was far more than enough waiting. He reached a large wooden door at the top of the staircase and pushed it open. Bracing himself for what awaited him, he emerged onto an outer foyer on the temple's tallest spire. A strange, disorienting sensation surged through him, as had been the case during his guided climb from the base of Mount Junga. An impenetrable mist enveloped his world, and he stared for a long moment at the sight before him. From a distance, the council chamber looked as if it were suspended in the air. In truth, it had been constructed atop a small, flat expanse of rock on the other side of a deep gorge. The only thing completing the pathway between the true summit and the rest of the temple was a rickety bridge of simple wood and rope. He had read about this during his time working in the library, but he had never contemplated what such a sight might actually look like. For an instant, the view took his breath away. He reached out with his hands and shuffled slowly across the bridge, looking anywhere but down. The foggy sky he glimpsed above him swirled with mystery. Just now, however, only one mystery concerned him. He needed to know how to rescue his future from the cruel grip of chance. That question, at least, is about to be answered, he thought, as he placed a hand on a large bronze door knocker. Slowly, the doors parted, and he entered a chamber at the center of which he found Vivek, Shakar, and Lata. Vivek stood tall and proud with his hands clasped behind his back. Shakar crossed his own in front of him, each arm hidden in the opposite sleeve of a voluminous robe. Dressed in garments to match her fellows, Lata had assumed her usual place in the center, looking much the same as she had on the day Amana had met her. The only differences were the bandages still wrapped around her gnarled hands. The elders stood in front of a large hearth in which blazed a miraculous sight. Great flames of purple and silvery white filled the room with light and dancing shadows and burned with unnatural silence. When he was, at last, able to tear his eyes away from the captivating fire, Amana stepped forward, and his footsteps echoed as he continued his approach. "Masters, I am honored," he said dutifully as he kneeled before them. "Truly, there is beauty here unmatched anywhere in the world. I've seen many strange and extraordinary things during my time here." He nodded toward the fire. "I'm eager to learn so much more." Looking down on him placidly, hunchbacked Shakar spoke first. "We can teach you nothing more, apprentice." Amana's heart leapt, and he fought to stay upright as blood rushed to his head and a fierce pounding filled his ears. How could that be? His sight only extended a few seconds. There had to be more they could have taught him. There just had to be. "Not yet," said Lata in a gentle voice. Amana stiffened slightly as he regained his composure. Still somewhat in shock, he blinked at the assembled elders and waited for them to explain.
"There is a village called Abarash, a day's journey from the base of Mount Junga,"
Vivek said in his deep, commanding voice.
"The nearest river runs with tainted waters, unfit for bathing, fishing, or drinking. You must go to them, help them, in the name of Umkarala."
Amana could not believe what he was hearing. Here, on the eve of his anniversary, he was once again being handed another pointless chore. When would this end? Did the monks think he would be content to carry out such menial tasks, day in and day out for the rest of his life, like Avishal? Didn't the very fact that the elders themselves had risen through the ranks to mastery prove that they knew the value of ambition? Surely they understood what was driving him. Why were they holding him back? "This is to be the last of your trials," Shakar explained, as though he knew perfectly well what Amana was thinking. Not for the first time, Amana wondered whether the old monk did in fact read minds. Amana kept his thoughts to himself as best he could as he weighed his options. Giving up would ensure that he had wasted a year of his life. Going forward, he no longer felt he could trust the monks. Every dreary task he'd performed had been replaced by another. "They say this will be your final test," hissed a voice in his head. "Yeah, well, they say a lot of things," said another. In the end, he found the cold emptiness inside him needed filling. and the lone morsel they dangled before him now was the only thing he could hope for. "What," he asked in a voice of determined calm, "would you have me do?" Vivek outstretched a sagely hand.
Use what we have taught you to help the villagers.
Teach them to help themselves,
Shakar intoned. Moving with grace and deliberation, Lata thrust her wooden staff into the purple-white flames behind her. She paused for a moment before twirling the staff to bring the burning tip directly in front of her wrinkled face. She spread her arms like a bird taking flight, and the staff stood upright, apparently of its own accord.
"Watch as your light spreads,"
Lata exclaimed as she clamped her hands on the end of the staff, allowing the flames to spread over her flesh.
"and let it guide you back to us, that we may show you the path to truth."
The bandages around her arms burned away, and the flames abated to reveal withered, bloodless, and unburnt hands. Six. Amana's teeth ground so loudly they drowned out the sounds of his footsteps as he stormed back down to the 5th floor. He ignored the faces of passerby as he moved through the halls, allowing his feet to carry him forward without conscious thought. After a year of slaving away, he was being trundled off to some inconsequential village on the edge of civilization. Fuming as he walked, he tried without success to guess at how long his task would take to complete. Weeks? Moons? Maybe even years? And why were they sending him alone on a mission of such importance? If the monks' priority was to help the ailing villagers, surely they would have entrusted the task to a fully fledged master of their order. They had provided no guidance and issued no specific decree. Left to his own devices, how was he supposed to clean the river? Just as the thought entered his mind, he passed the entrance to the library from which he'd fetched ancient books and tomes for the masters many weeks earlier. Amana bit his lip as he pondered whether or not to go inside. There's nobody here. Surely it couldn't hurt to take a quick look around. Who knew when he'd be returning to Mount Junga, and besides, hadn't he earned at least a taste of the higher mysteries so carefully guarded by the monks? He looked up and down the empty corridors before stepping into the library. The repository of knowledge was among the most elaborately decorated rooms anywhere in the temple. Ancient ladders and spiral staircases linked 3 stories of glossy hardwood. Enormous bookcases bore thousands of leather-bound volumes, faded maps, and other tomes. Marble plinths bearing tall sculptures of bronze and petrified wood were scattered throughout the aisles. The soft light of hundreds of candles illuminated walls covered with paintings and stone floors lined with carpets of dark red. A faint, musty scent filled Amana's nostrils as he crept around the library, moving with as much stealth as he could muster. He skimmed over an open manual detailing the organization of the library and visited the section concerned with health and medicine, where he hoped he might find something that might aid in his quest to help the village of Abarash. He thought back to his lessons brewing tea and gardening as he flipped through a dirty guide for the caring of exotic herbs and plants. Taking the manual between his teeth, he shifted books around and examined a few of the assorted trinkets on display before his attention was drawn to a moldy old tome entitled Herbal Medicines for Maladies. Reading while he walked, he moved to another section of the library divided into historical archives on the left and philosophy to the right. He filled a small woven basket with the 2 books he'd already sampled and continued browsing. He opened and immediately shut an unmarked book which had turned out to be a collection of poetry from the land of Vaj. The good that would do him. He bent low to sort through a large black chest filled to the brim with scrolls of parchment. After several minutes, he found a dusty collection of maps, some of which detailed the area surrounding Abarash, including the nearby Zieta River. Judging from the name and its description on the map, Amana supposed the Zieta must have once flowed with rushing white water. Either the ancient Abarashi people had an ironic sense of humor when they named the river long ago, or time had been most unkind in recent years. Lost in his musings, Amana stood up too quickly and bumped his head against the hard wooden shelf above him. Whispering furiously, he cursed himself as he steadied a rattling vase he'd nearly knocked from the shelf. The lingering noise rang ominously through the silence of the vast room, and Amana's heartbeat quickened as he glanced around in all directions. He stifled the sound of his heavy breathing and rolled his eyes upward as he sighed with relief. Across from him, he glimpsed a single bound scroll stowed apart from the others inside a wall-mounted case. Transfixed by the curious sight, he stashed the collection of maps in his basket as he moved to take a closer look. The scroll laid on a small plush pillow behind a thin pane of glass. A small tablet bearing an inscription sat at the front of the pillow. Amana's brow furrowed as he read the words, "The Scroll of the Balanced Five." What could this be? Was this the key to mastering the 5 paths? Could this be the solution to end his plight? Did this sacred document hold the answers he had been seeking so desperately ever since he arrived? Moving as quickly as he dared, Amana grabbed a random scroll from the black chest below. He grabbed an old writing utensil carved from reed and pried at the pane of glass. After a moment, the pane lifted upwards with a soft grating noise, and Amana swapped the 2 scrolls. He took a moment to examine his handiwork objectively, checking for any obvious sign of disturbance. When he was satisfied, he bolted away from the archives back toward the exit. He resumed walking normally, though with a pronounced jaunt in his step once he'd returned to the corridors. His eagerness to unfurl the secrets hidden within the scroll made the journey from top to bottom feel even longer than usual, but the thought of having something to look forward to had revived him a great deal. A few minutes later, he had placed the scroll on his sleeping mat and closed the door to his living quarters safely behind him. He unwound the scroll, but in his haste to read it, he'd overlooked the gloomy dark of night outside his window. He lit a candle in the corner of his room and returned to kneel before the miraculous scroll once more. Before he had the chance to read anything, a feeling of unease shot up his spine, and suddenly his short sight flashed before him. A withered old hand reached out before him to form a loose fist. As quickly as it had come, the vision had gone, like all the others. If only he could make them last more than a few seconds. But alas, he was again staring at the scroll in his hands, back in the present. Looking around, he found himself in his room, quite alone, but he knew he wouldn't be much longer. No sooner had he stashed the scroll in a pair of old slippers than he heard a knock at his bedroom door. He took a brief moment to compose himself before answering. As the door creaked open, he looked from right to left, seeing nothing at all.
"Up for a bit of bedtime reading, are we?"
came a quiet voice from below. Startled, Amana looked down to see Lata smiling up at him. "Master, please come in."
"Perhaps I misjudged the value of a good night's sleep when we spoke earlier this morning."
She hobbled into the room with a wry smile. The shadows of her hair crawled up the candlelit walls like a gigantic spider. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" Amana asked as she turned to face him.
"I apologize for calling at such a late hour, but I wanted a word with you before you leave,"
she said with her hands clasped behind her back. With great difficulty, he quelled the powerful urge to glance at the floppy old pair of shoes in the corner. "About what, master?" he asked with a steadiness he did not feel.
"Because I am your friend, Amana, I sense in you deep confusion, anger, and impatience. You wonder why it is we have chosen to send you far from here after all you've done. You wonder why it is we do not invite you to the peak. We dare not. Taking you to the peak before you are ready will destroy you. Junga is no friend to the lost."
Lata frowned deeply, as though to think of something long forgotten.
"Those who are lost must find themselves, and the mountain conceals truths with great ferocity and terrible vengeance. If you are not careful, you will become a mystery unto yourself. But there is more than one path to truth. Your final test will take place away from here, perhaps further than any of us can predict. You shall bear our teachings through the clear light of day. You shall move unfettered by the shroud of Junga's mists. Go back to the world you think you know, and look upon it truly for the first time."
Amana looked at her imploringly. He wanted to make her understand, but he wasn't sure if she could. Lata broke the long silence first.
"You've never said exactly what it was that brought you to us."
He opened his mouth to speak, but she cut him off in her gentle way.
"I'm not here to delve into your past. Not all seas are worth swimming in."
Her mouth broke into a toothless grin. Amana shifted uncomfortably as she stared at him.
"I may not know exactly what you're seeking,"
she continued, and a note of warning crept into her voice now.
"But you have been chasing after it most aggressively."
Amana nodded slowly before responding. "I told you I would do whatever it took to achieve true balance, and I meant it. My intentions are true. For my life to have meaning, I must succeed."
"You only live for the future and are captive to the past.
She took his strong hands in her veiny old ones. The loose skin and prominent veins belied her firm grip.
As your teacher, I can tell you the path before you is clear. As your friend, I can only ask that you try to stop looking for it. Stop chasing after the future. Let your destiny find you.
He opened his mouth, but let what he was about to say die in his throat as he bowed before her. Thank you, Master. I will do my best.
You've had a long day, and longer ones lie before you. Get some rest. Sleep tonight. Tomorrow is a new day.
Seven. The following morning, Amana packed a small travel wagon with supplies from the garden. After reading more from his borrowed library tomes, he stole a small pouch filled with the cleansing stones the monks used to purify water and several bottles of healing ointments and protective salves. Alongside the silent guide who had shepherded his first climb through the mountainous Junga trails 1 year earlier, Amana began his descent through the mists back to the world below. Several days later, they met a pair of young boys at a campsite they'd made near the mountain's base. The children had arrived from the Abarash a day earlier and had been expecting Amana. The 2 boys had brought 3 horses and a delivery of spices, grain, and other foodstuffs. Amana smiled to himself. So this explains why the temple kitchens were so well stocked. His silent guide took hold of the delivery from Abarash, and Amana affixed his own cart of supplies to the horse before mounting it. Taking the lead, the boys set off for their home with Amana traveling close behind them. The boys didn't speak much to Amana, but stared avidly at him for long stretches of time. They seemed to find him fascinating, but their eyes lacked the light of youth. They looked slightly underfed, but they were good-natured. On a few occasions, he attempted to make conversation by asking them questions about their village. They appeared easily confused and told him nothing beyond what the monks had said to him. He supposed they must have had a very limited education, and instead of asking more of them, he taught them songs to sing as they traveled. On the 3rd day of their uneventful trek, Amana caught his first glimpse of Abarash from a distance. As he drew closer, he saw the village in greater detail. Vegetable patches and crop fields surrounded the cluster of thatched rooftop buildings. Wooden huts and lumpy clay structures made up most of what he saw. As they entered the village square, a half-dozen women greeted them. They collected the children and horses, leading them off to the stables. As a small crowd of villagers cleared away, a powerfully built man of middle age and shorter than average height approached Amana.
Yameya, young one,
he exclaimed with the new moon's greeting, wringing Amana's hand with both of his own. Amana hadn't even known the new moons had passed. But sure enough, as he raised his eyes to the sky, Yum and Aya's moons crossed one another, denoting the 4th moon of the year.
My name is Tendaji. Thank you so much for coming,
the man said, looking up at Amana. His accent sounded more similar to the Vajis than it did to the monks or the other locals. Tendaji was balding and had mismatched eyes, both brown but one darker than the other. He wore simple trousers and a sleeveless vest that did not fully cover his broad chest. His face was kind, but his neck and forearms were covered in deeply lined scars and shiny old burns. One of his shoulders sagged lower than the other, and Amana's eyes were drawn to the sign of a deep gash, long since healed over. Battle scars. A veteran. Amana smiled down at the man, who was still grasping his hands. My name is Amana. Are you the chieftain? Tendaji gave a wheezy laugh.
I hope not, for all of our sakes, he said, gesturing around. I just happen to be too old and useless for the battlefield anymore. I keep a watchful eye out for my villagers these days. 2 would be ideal, but I've only got the 1 good eye, he said, pointing at the lighter one.
Amana laughed loudly, but the sound quickly died away as he caught sight of a group of girls hauling buckets of sloshing brown water. Tendaji noticed and shifted uncomfortably as he and Amana watched the girls march toward a large cookpot.
You've no idea how much this means, Tendaji said quietly. You've answered our prayers. I have never heard of a group so honorable, nor of heroes more noble than you monks. Ever since coming here years ago, I've spent my days as a friend to your order.
Amana bowed slightly.
If you don't mind me saying so, you're younger than I expected you to be,
Tendaji said after a moment had passed.
How long have you been a mountain monk?
Amana turned to face him. About 1 year, but I'm not really a Junga monk. Not yet. He glanced around again. It was a dismal sight. Everywhere he looked, he saw women with long, tired faces hard at work. Livestock were cramped in overcrowded pens, and children with muddy faces toiled away in the heat of the midday sun. Perhaps it was only his imagination, but the whole place seemed dull, lacking in color or vibrancy. Tendaji placed a hand on Amana's shoulder.
A room is being prepared for you where your belongings can be stored. I shall arrange for you to be shown around Abarash so you can get your bearings.
Amana raised an eyebrow. You won't be coming along? Tendaji laughed wheezily once more as he lifted the hem of his trousers to reveal a wooden stump where his right foot had once been.
You'll get along faster without me, young man. Any questions I can answer before you get underway?
Amana nodded slowly, staring around them at the passerby. Why are there only women and children? He asked solemnly. Where are the men? I see no boy older than 9 or 10.
Fighting on the front lines against the Vaji,
he grunted. A shadow crept across Tendaji's lined face.
There are some women with them too. The mystic women, that is. The war has already claimed a generation of Abarashi.
He pointed to a hut in the distance.
Our healers are there. The few who have returned are in our care. I am the luckiest.
The old man swallowed as his eyes misted over. Amana looked away. He appeared to be allowing Tendaji a moment's silence, but was, in truth, deep in thought. Why would a nation as powerful as Vaj bother with a tiny spit of land like Abarash? The Vaji attacked you? Is they fighting close by? Tendaji shrugged.
If the Vaji have their way, the whole world will bow to them before long. I can't pretend to fathom the minds of those monsters. Heinous conquerors, that's all they are. I got out of there the moment I could. Many other villages to the north have already fallen before their might. All I know is when the Vaji are on the warpath, you don't want to be in their way.
Amana kept his thoughts to himself. He had only dealt with the Vaji marginally when he raided their ships in the Sapphire Seas. Then they were known for their artistry, not their military prowess. Their defeats in Esowon were well known. Perhaps that was why they pushed their front into the east instead of the west. The desert nation wouldn't trouble itself with Abarash or its sister villages without some larger goal in mind. But Amana had enough to worry about as it was, and decided to leave the Vaji mystery for another day. After catching Tendaji's eye, Amana returned to business. I've brought a selection of balms and salves crafted by my instructors. Your healers are free to help themselves. I'll take the rest of the day to wander around Abarash. I'll let you know what I plan to do come night. After a renewed outbreak of enthusiastic handshaking and gratitude from Tendaji, Amana took his leave. He'd waved off Tendaji's offer of a guided tour, electing to explore the village for himself. What he saw was not encouraging. He visited the healers' huts where his tonics and ointments were being applied to dozens of convalescent soldiers. Most were Tendaji's age, though a few were far younger. None were older. The women's hands worked tirelessly, dressing countless wounds with bandages and healing poultices. As he strode around the village hours later, he bumped into the pair of girls he'd observed carrying muddied waters earlier. He helped them steady their bucket, but a portion of water slopped over the edge and onto the ground. Forgive me, he said kindly. Did you get this from the Zayeta? The girls looked at one another before fixing him with confused expressions. You mean the rock? One of them asked. Amana stared at them. I thought the river was called the Zayeta, an ancient and beautiful name. It means white, he explained. To his surprise, the girls laughed. There's nothing white or bright about the Rog, said one of the girls as they stumbled off toward the cookpot. Amana followed them and helped them tip the bucket into the cauldron. He decided he should see the river for himself before going any further. How far is the Rog? He asked. The second girl pointed to a walkway behind him which led away from the village. A short walk that way? Amana nodded. And the broken dam? A day or two away by horse, she said. To the west. Amana thanked them and walked toward the Rog. When he finally laid eyes on the brown, fetid waters, he fell to his knees. It was even worse than he'd expected. There were no men to help him repair the dam, no elemental mystics to help him shift the rocks. The only ones who lived were away at war or crippled in bed. Between caring for the sick and infirm and running their households, the women were overworked as it was. How was he supposed to fix this on his own? He pulled the pouch of purity stones from his belt and weighed them in his hands. If only he had more of them. Or perhaps a few giant stones. But the monks had never shown him how they were made. And then he remembered. A couple of hours later, after returning to Abarash, Amana was shown to the room Tendaji had set aside for him. As the old veteran had promised, the supplies he'd brought with him from Mount Junga sat waiting for him in the furthest corner of the room. He found what he was looking for in a sack full of spare clothes and shoes. He reached into the bag and fished out the book concerning rare plants and herbs he'd grabbed from the library. He rifled through the pages. Lata had told him she'd brought the last known sample of Aya's grace to the temple herself. If she had, it stood to reason she might have left instructions on how to care for the plant. She had. As he read, Amana's brow furrowed in frustration. Everything Lata had already said about the flower was written there. He didn't need to know how to look after Aya's grace. He needed to know how to craft the purity stones. He tossed the manual aside and sank to the floor, gazing up at the bare walls of the room. The sun was setting. Soft amber light shone through the crack under the door. He took a deep, calming breath, and the smell of mold filled his nose. Sniffing softly, he looked around for the source of the foul odor and traced it to his bag of supplies. He emptied the sack onto the floor and gasped. The dirty old tome of venoms lay before him. He had forgotten this one. He flipped through the delicate pages with great care. Surely a book about poisons must contain a chapter or two on antidotes. And there it was, a description of purity stones and their common uses written in the margins. After reading through the early stage of a chapter, he lost a great deal of confidence in his plan. The process involved a dangerous ritual requiring great personal risk. As his finger passed over a foreign incantation, he shook his head hopelessly. This was too much for him. He was no sorcerer. Still, something about the chapter called to him. He found he did not want to put the book down, and against his better judgment he continued to read. Taking a closer look, he noticed some steps were detailed in an archaic language he did not understand. Was it the Old Tongue? Many of these had been crossed out and replaced by annotations written in the mother tongue. He reached the end of the chapter. A smudge obscured the name of the original author, but underneath he read the name Uzoma. The Lost One? Amana closed the book with a thud. The monks certainly wouldn't like to hear he'd literally taken a leaf out of Uzoma's book. He would have to find another way. Later that evening, Amana found Tendaji back in the kitchen of his farmhouse. The old soldier stirred a large pot of brown, bland-smelling stew, around which a small crowd of villagers had formed. Amana wondered how in the world he was going to say what he had to say with all these people around, but after a short time he realized that none of the villagers seemed intent on staying. Each left as soon as his or her bowl had been filled by Tendaji's ladle. From the way they spoke and moved amongst themselves, Amana got the strong impression that the group usually ate with Tendaji, but tonight it seemed he had made arrangements to dine in private. This will make it easier, at least. He stood off to the side, watching as the line dwindled slowly. He stared at the many tired expressions of the women, which contrasted sharply against the round, guileless faces of the children. Wayfaring sailors cast adrift in a sea of youthful bliss. Finally, when the kitchen had been emptied, save for the pair of them, Tendaji motioned for Amana to join him in the next room where a fire crackled merrily within a stone hearth. Tendaji passed a large bowl of stew to Amana, and the two sat on a tattered rug of purple and gold that must have once looked grand. Amana thanked him, and the two ate in silence for a moment. Amana set his bowl down after only a few mouthfuls and tried, without success, to speak. He knew he was going to have to be the bearer of bad news, but he couldn't summon the words. The old soldier seemed oblivious to the storm raging inside him, which only made things more awkward. Smiling widely, Tendaji suddenly turned his mismatched eyes to Amana's.
I can't thank you enough for what you're about to do.
His quivering voice choked with emotion. Amana felt as though he'd been stabbed, though no trace of discomfort showed on his face. About that, Amana began, speaking slowly. I'm not sure the village has the supplies I require. He found he couldn't hold Tendaji's gaze any longer, so he closed his eyes to steel himself before continuing. You lack the manpower required to repair the dam. Even if you did, the process would take many moons. The distance between your village and the new building site would require much time for the transport of materials alone. Tentaji looked crestfallen for a moment, but Amana went on before the old man could speak. We could perhaps attempt to fashion new pumps. Running water would be closer at hand and could eliminate some of the constant back-and-forth trips between the river and here. But without the dam, the water is too heavily polluted for even a well to guarantee safe bathing or drinking. You would need to boil water for every last cup. Firewood is too scarce for that to last throughout the year. The problem lies at the source the dam used to check. With great effort, he returned his gaze to Tendaji's. Amana's words came out grimly. As long as the poison tributary flows to your river, nothing I do from here will offer a permanent solution. A heavy silence settled between them, as thick and obtrusive as the mists of Mount Junga. Something in the fire seemed to die away, and all warmth seeped out of the air. From beneath his overgrown eyebrows and bushy white beard, the old man's eyes looked like caves in a hillside covered in white rain. For a moment, Amana simply sat and watched as Tendaji's chest heaved up and down. The younger man clenched his fists and braced himself, not knowing what to expect. Anger? Attack? Certainly not tears. Tendaji's head dropped forward and bobbed up and down as he wept softly. Feeling like an intruder, Amana sat, not knowing what to say or do. He looked on helplessly for a few seconds as Tendaji apologized and began to compose himself. Amana wished he could turn tail and run from the farmhouse and straight out of the village. He felt as though he were watching something indecent and private, and felt disgusted with himself for bringing it about. The uncharacteristic sign of weakness from such a grizzled warrior rattled him. He wasn't entirely sure why Tendaji's outburst had affected him so deeply, but something about it left him feeling squeamish. He wanted desperately to leave, but instead he stood up and walked toward the older man and placed a hand on his shoulder. Tendaji gave a dry sob, and Amana quelled the urge to recoil.
We cannot leave,
Tendaji said, wiping his eyes with the back of his wrist. He continued as his voice shuddered breathlessly.
We have nowhere else to go. I cannot go back to Vaish. Even if I did, how would we all make such a journey? How would we rebuild? We'd be hated there.
He shook his head fiercely as the light of the fireplace danced wildly in his black and white eyes.
No. This place is all we have.
Amana thought hard about it before replying. There is one other possibility. I may know a way to purify the water at its source, but it will take weeks, and I will need supplies, and a guide to the place where the dam collapsed. Tendaji looked at him as though unsure whether to believe his one good eye.
I know where you can find both.
Amana waited patiently for him to continue.
There is a marketplace to the west, where my daughter sells what she can. She is the only trader our village has. She can show you where to find whatever you may need, and she knows the road to the tributary.
What is her name? Amana asked. When he spoke, Tendaji's mouth broke into a blinding white grin that outshone the dying fire in the corner of the room.
Manale.
The name sounded like butter on his lips.
She will show you where you need to go.
The sun shone brilliantly in a sky of purest blue as Amana moved through the marketplace on foot. He tied his horse to a post just outside the guarded entryway of a fortified city on the edge of an expansive desert. Dressed in well-worn garments of red and yellow, he walked with head and neck wrapped to guard against the harsh rays of light from above. Cracked walls of weathered sandstone surrounded a mass of huts, domiciles, and other structures. The cluster of buildings ranged in tones from pale brown and beige to yellow and orange. Tented tables piled high with fruits, meats, and other foodstuffs attracted enormous buzzing flies. Ornamental rugs and carpets lined walls with streaks of gold, indigo, green, and red. Smoke from cook fires and the smells of livestock and their various droppings hung in the motionless air. Men and women of all ages swarmed the streets, examining goods on display for as far as the eye could see. Merchants and their patrons shouted to be heard as they haggled, while spirited children darted between their legs. Amana took a deep breath as he savored the noise of the day. 2 days' ride had brought him to the center of what had once been the meeting place for a host of traveling caravans from 7 far-flung tribes, Or so the story went. The archaic route formed the basis for the name of the now permanent settlement, and Amana strolled at a leisurely pace through the streets of the Seven Serpents. He took another deep breath as he surveyed the clamoring crowds. The somber mood of poverty-stricken Abarashi had done little to remind him of the life he'd led before apprenticing himself to Mount Junga. His year cloistered away with the monks had been largely characterized by periods of solitude and quiet contemplation. Among both the stoic monks and the solemn-faced villagers, he had felt like an outsider. But here, for the first time in countless moons, he felt like he was truly back among the living. He walked for the better part of an hour before he found what he was looking for. At the westernmost edge of the market city, he spotted a short elderly man with a heavy beard browsing at a fish stand operated by a young copper-skinned girl. She looked no more than 12 or 13, but she was tall for her age, dressed simply in a sleeveless white shirt accompanied by drab brown trousers. On her feet she wore sandals which looked as though they had been inexpertly repaired many times. Her dark brown hair extended to her shoulders in loose curls she had wrapped in a vibrant green scarf. Her smoky green eyes appeared slightly overlarge, set in too thin a face, and glistening white teeth flashed as she spoke animatedly with her single customer. "When did you say you caught these?" the old man asked suspiciously as he held one fish up by its tail to take a closer look. "They're as fresh as can be," she said excitedly in an accent that sounded something between Tendaji's and the locals. "They stink!" the man cried, waving the fish in her face. The girl rushed her speech. "I brought them straight from the river, less than a day's ride from here. You can still cure them or smoke them. If you buy 2, I'll throw in a 3rd for free." The old man shook his head impatiently and threw the fish away from him with such force it bounced off her table and fell to the ground. He walked away grumbling and cursing to himself as he wiped the slime on his tunic. Glaring after him, she bent to one knee to pick up the dusty fish. As she rose back to her full height, she caught Amana's eye, and embarrassment passed over her face. "See anything you like?" she asked less than exuberantly. "I think I do, little one," Amana replied as he stepped closer to have a look at her stand. "I see opportunity." "That makes one of us, foreigner," she said in a low voice, clearly taken by Amana's island accent. She smirked as she looked up and down the street. "You say you caught all these yourself?" Amana asked. "That's the easy part," the girl said, pointing to a horse-drawn cart in the distance behind her, which bore an assortment of barrels, nets, and fishing poles. Amana was genuinely impressed. "Are they, truly as fresh as you claimed?" he asked carefully. "Well, yes. Not that it makes much of a difference," she said heavily. Her next words almost came as a whisper. "They come from the Rogue." "And you sell them here on your own?" he asked, allowing his admiration to color his voice. "I try," she said, shaking a small purse of clinking coins. "This has been a better day than most." She placed a hand on her hip, where Amana now saw a dagger sheathed in her belt. "Even the market thieves know better than to pay me much attention. Not that they don't visit me from time to time." Amana placed his hands on his knees and squatted to look her in the eye. "You're too honest, little one." She shot him a questioning look before he went on. "You're a talented angler, and as bright as anyone here." He waved around at the sea of people surrounding them. "But if you're going to succeed, you've got to learn to play to the crowd. Today, you're not a merchant. You're an actor." He waved around at the sea of people surrounding them. She shook her head like a dog. "What do you mean?" Amana took a long sweeping look at the many guileless faces milling about. "Can I show you something?" he whispered. Nodding, she stared at him as he pointed dramatically from fish to fish, counting aloud as he circled the display. When he reached the vendor's side, he stooped to take a look beneath the blanketed table. To his delight, she had nothing stored underneath except for a few empty bowls and plates. He asked if she minded whether he touched the fish. When she shook her head, he piled all but 2 of them onto a single large platter. "You want all of those?" she asked, her eyes wide with excitement. "Oh, I'm afraid I can't afford all these," Amana said with mock sorrow as he hid the platter underneath the table. "But I know who can." He gave her a sly smile. She crossed her arms and regarded him suspiciously as he winked. He caught the eye of a woman wearing robes of deep blue holding the hand of a small boy. "You there, sweet lady. Can I interest you in the catch of the day? Come and sample the finest fish you've ever tasted. You and your son will eat well tonight. A toothsome fish, sure to challenge the experienced palate or enlighten the young and untested. Preconceptions shall be challenged, minds broadened." The woman stepped forward and sniffed at the fish, wrinkling her nose at the unpleasant smell. She looked at Amana in astonishment. I know the scent may be a bit unusual, but trust me, properly cleaned and cured, these are highly sought-after delicacy.
They're supposed to smell like this?
She inquired. He had her attention now. He didn't waste a moment in pressing his advantage. So high in demand are my beloved fish that I'm afraid stocks are low. As you can see, I have only 2 left. Let a man rest after a hard morning's work, yes? Buy the last of my catch and make us both happy. Shrugging, the woman accepted the fish and tossed a few fat coins onto the table, which he promptly refilled with another 2 fish once the woman had vanished from sight around a corner. The girl gasped as Amana turned to face her, smiling widely. Keep an eye out for those who have traveled far, he said jovially. You can tell from the way they move, the colors they wear, their style of hair. He nodded to a couple who wore bright silks of orange and red, their heads bedecked with head wraps sewn with an intricate design. They're less likely to get wise to us than the locals. And together the 2 repeated this trick over the next couple of hours until finally all the funky fish had disappeared. After the last pair had been unloaded, the girl looked up at Amana, silenced by overwhelming gratitude. Her eyes shone with happiness as the money bag jingled merrily in her shaking hands. Put that to good use, Amana said in a stern voice, but his eyes twinkled with mirth.
I can't accept all this, not when you earned it all, she exclaimed, biting her lip as though in thought. Split it with me, then.
Amana shook his head with a small chuckle. I don't need your coin, little one. He paused for just a moment as though a thought passed over his eyes. But there is another way you can help me.
Anything, she exclaimed. Anything at all.
I need a guide, Amana said. Someone who knows every inch of this marketplace and the land surrounding the old Zayeta Dam. He produced Lada's tome from within his robes and flipped to the recipe he'd memorized the first night he'd spent in Abarash. Can you show me where I might find these ingredients? Her eyes widened as she read this list.
Yes, I can indeed, sir.
And once you have, will you show me to the site of the collapsed dam, Manali? Amana asked. Surprise blossomed in her eyes, and misgiving mingled oddly with the look of joy on her face.
You know my name?
Her hand moved towards her dagger once more. Amana placed his palms on his knees and bent to look her in the eye. I have a bit of a confession to make. I know your father, Tendaji. He said you may be able to show me the way to the site where the Zayeta Dam collapsed. Given the bounty of fish you caught on your own, I can see this must be true. She stared at him for a long moment, but the fingers gripping the knife at her side relaxed a little as Amana spoke. I am sorry for deceiving you. Our meeting was not by chance. I came to the 7 Serpents to find you. I have helped you. Now please, help me. Hey! Before he could finish speaking, Manali sprang up and bolted away from him with startling speed. Amana ran after her, rounding corner after corner, only just barely able to keep up with the girl as she darted left and right, taking advantage of her small size as she moved through the crowds. As they passed into a large square, he lost sight of her. When he finally emerged from the sea of people flooding the center of the city, he faced a fork in the path. He came to a stop, panting slightly. Ahead of him lay 2 barren streets. At the start of one, he saw a green scarf lying on the ground. In front of the other, a pair of mismatched dirty sandals. The girl has talent. Staring around, Amana gave thought to his next course of action. Logically, the girl would have to return to Abarash. He supposed he would just have to beat her there. Hopefully, her father would help make her see sense. Grumbling to himself at this latest disruption to his plans, he retraced his steps. As he walked, his vision flashed before him, pulling him back to the entrance of the marketplace. As his vision returned to the present, he sprinted with greater urgency than ever before. Manali would recognize her father's horse. If she got there first, he'd be stranded here. He scaled the side of a small building and covered the distance by leaping from rooftop to rooftop, much faster than he ever could winding his way through the maze of streets below. As he reached the gates of the 7 Serpents, he jumped from the rooftop of a 4-story building to a long ladder that reached the top of the market city's walls. From the top, he spied a small figure shooting across the sand, heading straight for his mount. He tore the head wrappings from his own robes and draped them over a rope drawn between 2 guard towers. Holding on to both ends with one hand each, he jumped forward, sliding along the line. After a few exhilarating seconds, he let go, allowing himself to drop down to the desert below, landing between the horse and Manali just as the girl reached for the reins. "Now," he said, panting heavily. "As I was saying, I'll be needing a guide." The girl reached for her dagger, but Amana was too quick for her, his short sight giving him the split-second warning he needed. Placing a foot behind her own, he pushed out against her shoulder. Though she caught herself as she tripped, the move bought Amana enough time to grab the knife from her sheath, and in one fluid motion he cut the money purse from her belt as well. "I think I'll be keeping this for now," he said, looking down at her. "And in return for the trouble you've put me through, I'll take a small cut out of your profits, after all. Don't worry, though, the rest can still be yours if you only do as I say." Manali gazed up at him, mouth agape. Who are you? What do you want with me?" Fear and suspicion had fallen away from her face, replaced by a look of confused curiosity. "My name is Amana. I've come to save your village." Nine. 3 days later, 2 trails of footsteps, one small, the other large, traced the banks of the Rog. The languid waters of the river ran brown, and a cool breeze carried the fetid smell of vegetation and swamp life. Amana kneeled in the muck of a large deposit of earth, filling large buckets of clay. He had spent the previous day carrying clumps of clay from the riverside to a small clearing nearby where Manali had built a roaring fire. Promising to return the money after receiving her assistance, Amana had gained Manali's reluctant cooperation. The two had returned to her stand in the marketplace to collect her own cart and mount before completing their shopping at the various apothecaries spread throughout the market. Manali's knowledge of the various shop owners' wares had assisted greatly in the procurement of every ingredient Amana needed for the purity stones. Using a mortar and pestle, Manali had ground the herbs and pastes into a fine powder which Amana had bound using more clay before smoothing the substance into an orb the size of his head. As Amana continued his work in the clay deposits throughout the day, Manali had repeated the process 11 more times. Now they had a dozen stones ready for sanctification. The rest was up to Amana. Still, he hadn't let Manali return to the village with her payment. The girl had her uses. She tended to their campfire while Amana was hard at work, though she no longer trusted him fully as when they had first met, keeping an eye out for wildlife or potential intruders worked to her own benefit as much as Amana's. Unfortunately, the girl wasn't much for company, begrudging as her services were. Amana understood. He'd felt much the same during his time with the monks on many occasions. However, while he could empathize with her given the nature of their working relationship, he felt no guilt for the way he handled the situation. She stood to gain a handsome reward for her part in this deal, and he had, after all, only been acting for the good of the village. "Come here and help me with this," he said to her as he brought in a final haul of clay. He emptied the buckets onto a large heap he'd been gathering since their arrival to this place. "What are you building?" she asked huffily as she joined him in shaping the clay into a large dome. "A kiln. We need a large oven to bake the stones. The stones must burn in the intense heat of a blessed fire for 7 days, long enough for Yem and Aya both to smile upon them. Of course, the kiln itself needs time to dry out and harden before it will serve our purposes."
7 days? She cried in shocked disbelief. We have to stay here for 7 days?
Amana nodded patiently as they continued their work. "It's why I used my portion of the money to buy so much food. We'll be here for a while, and as good as you are with your fishing pole, I don't plan on eating anything that swims in the Rog. Not just yet, at any rate." She piled some clay haphazardly on the slowly forming kiln with a haughty look on her face and smoothed the lumps over with unnecessary force. She was threatening to do more harm than good. Amana thought for a moment about dismissing her and continuing on his own, but if he could get her to care about what they were doing, the job could be completed so much more quickly. "Remember why I'm doing this," he said with as much excitement as he could. "I'm trying to help your village."
"No, you're not," Manali spat.
"Excuse me?" She fixed him with a cold, penetrating look which bore the suggestion of wisdom too deep for her age. Something about it reminded Amana of Vivek.
"You're not just here to help the Abarash," she said. "You wouldn't be doing this if you weren't going to get something out of it."
Amana rocked his head from side to side. "True enough, I guess, but does that really change anything? You're still getting what you need, aren't you?" Her look softened somewhat, and she nodded.
"Yes, I suppose I am. But my parents are honest folk. They taught me not to lie. You're not trustworthy," she sneered, picking at a spot of dirt on her cheek.
"You didn't mind that when you had something to gain yourself," Amana reminded her. She adopted a thoughtful expression and shrugged before joining him in the work. Her hands moved more gracefully across the clay formation as she mimicked his actions. This was good. He had her attention and she was making the effort. Before he began his ritual, though, he knew he would need to gain her trust if he wanted to survive. "You never mentioned your mother before," Amana said, speaking tentatively. "You spoke of her as though she's alive. I had assumed, well, you know. Why isn't she back at the village? Why doesn't your father talk about her?"
She left,
Manali said sadly, though she continued working diligently as she spoke. "For another man?" Amana asked. He didn't want to pry too deeply into a sensitive subject, but curiosity had gotten the better of him, and the earlier mention of her parents seemed to have a softening effect on Manali. "Absolutely not," she spat in a renewed bout of fury. "Forgive me," Amana said earnestly. "It's just, well, you were a bit vague."
"She left to find my brother,"
she explained, resting her hands for the first time. "You have a brother?"
"Had one."
Her voice went low.
"He left to fight in the war when I was 9. He had to go far away and...
Tears welled in her eyes but did not fall. Instead, she sniffed them back as though it were a frequent habit.
Anyway, my mother couldn't accept his loss."
"And she was confident enough to travel alone?" Amana asked. Manali spoke through her tears.
"She can touch the elements. She can handle herself. She's not in her right mind. Father said she's on a journey she'll never complete."
Amana frowned. "I'm sorry." He turned away from her. I'll finish this on my own. Go and rest a bit. Have something to eat."
"No," she said brightly, sniffing as she wiped her eyes. "I want to get this over with. I'll stay and help."
Night had fallen by the time their work was complete, and after tending to their mounts, they settled on opposite sides of the fire. Amana stoked at the flames with a long stick as Manali stared at him. Her green eyes shone brilliantly in the soft light.
"What is it?"
she demanded. Apparently, they'd maintained eye contact longer than he'd realized. "Sorry," he said quickly. "It's just that you remind me of someone."
"Who?"
she asked, far more gently than before. "My daughter, Sana," Amana said, without really meaning to. Manali shook her head.
"What sort of monk has children?"
"Not a very good one," Amana admitted, deciding not to delve too deeply into his past prior to joining the monks. Silence fell between them, disrupted only by the croaking of frogs near the river and the crackling of the fire. She turned her face away from his slightly, but her eyes remained fixed on his own. She seemed caught between wanting to look away and not feeling able to.
"Where is she now? Your daughter?" she finally asked.
Amana tore his eyes away from hers at last and stared at the blackened logs burning between them. "Far away," he sighed heavily. Manali nodded her understanding. She stood and circled around the fire, taking one of his hands between hers.
"Maybe she's out there somewhere, holding hands with my brother."
For the first time in a long, long while, a genuine smile spread across Amana's face. Manali's brow furrowed as she brought a gentle hand up to touch his face.
"You look so sad when you smile."
The following morning, Amana instructed Manali to forage for firewood. While she was gone, he went over the process for summoning blessed fire described in the volume on healing poisons. When Manali returned, he piled up the wood she'd collected outside the kiln. Once the job was complete, Amana turned to face her. "Manali, there's a reason I needed you to stay with me after you brought me here," he said.
"Yes?"
His tone became suddenly grave. "I'm about to summon a blessed fire. The ritual will involve a sacrifice from me. I will be weakened when we're done. It will be up to you to complete the process." He locked eyes with her. "You must do exactly what I tell you to do. I'm placing my trust in you." He pulled the money purse from his belt and tossed it at her feet. "Just so you can see, the only one with anything to lose is me. Please, don't let me down. I need this to work. It has to work."
"I won't, Amana," she promised, fear laced in her eyes.
"Grab a branch from the campfire," he said. "When, and only when I tell you, use it to light the kiln." Manali nodded dutifully. Amana drew her knife from his belt. Gripping the blade with his left hand, he slid the knife across it in a swift cutting motion, leaving a deep, bloody slash on his left palm. He ran his injured hand across every piece of wood piled within a shallow pit, leaving long, bloody streaks on each log as he went. Speaking in a tongue he did not understand, Amana recited a prayer he'd read from the book as he gripped one of the logs firmly. Gradually, the log lost some of its color and grew engorged. Though Amana had researched the ritual, he hadn't expected to be weakened so quickly. Amana stared as the logs sprouted roots that dug deep into the earth. His spirit, like a ravenous weed, watered with his own blood. As he held the log in his still bleeding hand, he signaled for Manali to light the fire as he continued his strange prayer. Shocked, the girl shook her head in horror at the thought.
"Not with your hands in the fire," she screamed.
"It will be all right, Manali," he barked. "Now do as I say." He said the prayer again, and again the logs grew larger and paler. He raised his voice as he continued and motioned for her to do it again, and again she shook her head. "Manali, you must light the fire," he shouted.
"I can't. It isn't right," she cried.
"Do it! Now! Come on, do it or I will die!"
No.
"Manali, please!" he screamed, eyes bulging. "Do it for your mother! Do it for your brother! Do it for my daughter! Light the fire!" And she dropped the branch. Purple flames erupted in a dazzling blaze that engulfed the pile of kindling and traveled up Amana's left arm. He turned his head away from the blinding flash of light and slowly crumpled to the ground. Manali rushed and heaved him on his back. She bent low to examine his hand and found the injury had healed. No sign of blood or burns anywhere on his arm. She stared at him in wonder as he smiled weakly up at her. "Place the stones in the flames and cover the pit with the kiln."
"What then?"
she asked as a wave of relief passed over her face.
"Make sure I don't die,"
he said in a slow, lumbering voice as he passed out. Amana spent the next 2 days slipping in and out of consciousness. Manali prepared food and drink whenever he awoke, and by the 3rd day his strength had largely returned. On the 7th morning of the burning, Amana brought a hammer down on the kiln. 3 heavy blows was all it took to shatter the clay dome. The 12 purity stones glistened in the sunlight, the largest pearls in all the world.
"They're beautiful,"
Manali gasped, passing her hand over the flawless white surfaces of one of the orbs. "Yes, it seems almost a shame to sink them in the river," Amana agreed. Together they loaded the stones into Manali's fish cart and brought them to the place on the river where the dam had ruptured. There they wove her assortment of nets together, forming an enormous pocket in which they stuffed the precious stones. They scaled the slabs of rubble, which were all that remained of the dam, and heaved the bundle over the side. They heard it splash as they ran as quickly as they dared back to the shoreline. A needle-like geyser of spouting water rushed over the jagged rock, quickly replacing the murky brown waters with a powerful stream of pure blue-white. As they surveyed their handiwork, Amana pulled a second pouch of goods from his robes and handed it to an awestruck Manali who looked as though she had never seen clean water before. Perhaps she hadn't, Amana thought. "Thank you for your help, little one," he smiled down on her. "I really couldn't have done this without you." She took the bag from him but didn't look at it.
"Aren't you coming back with me to Abarash? My people, my father, they will want to thank you for what you've done."
"I'm afraid I must be going. My assignment here is complete, and I'm eager for its reward. I've been waiting a long time." Amana stared off into the distance. Though he could not see Junga Mountain from where they stood, he knew it was just on the horizon. "I've spent the last few weeks in the service of your village, but I spent the last year in service to the monks. It's time for me to return to Mount Junga." Amana looked at her bare feet and remembered how she had ditched her shoes on the market street several days earlier. "I have one more thing for you." He pulled a floppy set of leather-bound shoes from his travel bag. "They'll be a bit large on you, but they'll make your journey back to Abarash more comfortable." She smiled warmly, and her green eyes watered as she accepted his final gift.
"Is there anything else I can do for you before you leave?"
Manali asked. "If, by chance, the monks should ask how well I served your people, tell them the truth," Amana said with a twinkle in his eyes as he swung one leg over his horse. Once his horse broke into its first trot, Manali called for him to stop. He turned to face her as she came running up to him.
"Wait! I found this in the shoes you gave me," she said.
In her hand, she held the scroll of the 5 paths Amana had stolen from the temple's library. He stared at her in wonder as he took the forgotten scroll from her. He wanted to open it here and now. Here was his reward. Who gave a damn what the monks thought now? But no. Now that his job was complete, the monks were finally going to accept him into their ranks. He had completed his mission more quickly and with greater success than they'd had any right to expect. Was he really about to trade the opportunity to learn everything the monks knew for a simple scroll? "Thank you, little one," he said as she placed the scroll in his bag. "You've given me more than you could ever know." She didn't look as though she understood, but she grinned all the same. "Be well, Manali," he shouted over his shoulder as he sped away. "One day I hope we meet again." The night was cold, and the council chamber swam with purple-white light, just as it had on the eve before Amana's departure for Abarash weeks earlier. He inhaled the scent of burning incense and brewing pelepe tea as he stood waiting alone in the center of the room. All told, 24 days had passed since he'd bid farewell to Manali on the banks of the Zayeta River. His return journey back to the base of Mount Junga had been largely uneventful, but had seemed to take an eternity. Upon his return, the guide who resided at the start of the trail had been standing ready to receive Amana. Just as had happened a year earlier, Amana had embarked on a 5-day-long journey up the mountain with his silent guide leading the way. This time around, however, the mountain seemed far less intimidating than it had before. The climb was still physically taxing, but the spells of madness he'd experienced in the past did not return, and he was able to keep pace with his guide without the need to stop for rest. When he returned, a pair of masters provided him with sleeping quarters on the 5th floor. They told him the elders were locked in conclave and would send for him when they were ready for him. That had been 14 days ago. Amana had expected to be sent for long before now, but he had nevertheless reported to the council chamber after having received his summons earlier that same morning. Now he stood staring at the great hearth with his hands clasped behind his back, ready to face the elder masters. A quartet of masters entered the room, and he turned from the fire to face them. They all looked much the same. Long shaggy beards and great locks of twisted hair hung from their scalps and faces, and all were clad in shimmering robes of purple and white to match the fire before which Amana stood. "A feast has been prepared for you at the summit," one of them said. "Please come with us." Surprise and delight filled the creases in Amana's impatient face. Feeling buoyant, he strode over to join them. The beating of drums thumped lightly ahead, and the soft sounds of woodwind instruments echoed against the walls as they steered him through a corridor opposite from the chamber's large heavy door, which led to a dining area perched on an outer plateau he had never seen before. Torches burned silently with the same purple flames that lit the chamber, and the night air felt impossibly warm. Platters piled high with food and jugs filled with water and pots of tea covered a table carved from a humongous slab of black stone. 20 or so chairs surrounded the table, and each was occupied by a master. Amana was directed to a seat at the center of the table, opposite Lata, who was, as ever, flanked by Vivek and Shikar. Lata smiled gently as he approached. He adopted a friendly expression, but felt slightly uncomfortable as she peered up at him from where she sat. Perhaps it was only his imagination, but Amana thought she looked even older than he had remembered, and she looked unusually tired and frail. Amana inclined his head in a respectful bow. "Masters, this is a great honor." Vivek regarded him blankly as the young man took his seat. Shikar poured a cup of tea and handed it to Lata before pouring a second for himself.
"How fare you from your travels?"
Shikar asked. "I must admit, it was a pleasant experience living among people like the ones I once knew. In many ways, it served as a powerful reminder of what brought me here in the first place. I want to live a life of dignity. I want to make a difference. I want to feel as fulfilled as I did on the day I saved Abarash. I want to carry that feeling here within me for the rest of my days." He placed a hand over his heart. His words were true. He did want to go back to such a life, but not before he achieved his revenge. Then and only then would he allow himself a life of peace. Vivek raised a curious eyebrow.
"Really? You seem unchanged since your departure."
"I remain as resolute as ever," Amana agreed. "But I feel steady and more sure of myself than I used to be. The journey taught me a great deal. I see the practical value in your teachings more clearly than I could before." Vivek cast a sidelong glance at Shikar, who spoke next.
This is good. Tests are meant to demonstrate greater understanding. Fortunately, even failed tests provide further opportunities to learn.
What did that mean? Amana didn't quite know what to say to that, so he remained silent. He looked from Shikar to Lata, who appeared not to notice him as she sipped her tea. To fill the mildly uncomfortable pause in the conversation, he reached for the nearest plate of roasted vegetables tossed with grains, but Vivek held up a hand to stop him.
We have something special for you,
he said in his familiar, calm baritone. He clapped his hands twice, and a pair of apprentices Amana had not noticed approached from behind. They placed a covered platter in front of Amana. Vivek stood and removed the cover, revealing a platter filled with pungent smoked fish. Amana glanced around in confusion. The monks did not eat meat or fish. "What is this?" he asked, voice laced with confusion. Vivek gestured with the cover, his voice ominous.
I was about to ask you the same thing.
Amana shook his head in true bewilderment. As Vivek resumed his seat, the rest of the table, save for his fellow elders, rose up. Amana watched as the masters slowly filed from the room in silence. Soon everyone, even those who had been playing music, had gone from the plateau. With his eyes closed, Shikar took a deep breath before cutting his gaze to meet Amana's.
I purchased this fish from a trader in the Seven Serpents 16 days ago.
He paused to let his words hang in the air. Amana looked pointedly at Lata, whom he now felt sure was purposely avoiding his eye. He watched the old woman swallow, with her lips pursed as Shikar went on.
Why is Tendaji's daughter still selling rancid fish now that the Zayata runs with clear water?
Amana lowered his head in genuine sorrow. The girl must have still been selling her old stock. But why? The river had run clean. He stared at his hands as Vivek leaned forward to address him grimly once more.
Amana, you and I have never seen eye to eye. Not since you first arrived here, and this is exactly why.
There was a fire in his eyes Amana had never seen before.
Take heed, young one. There is no such thing as an inconsequential action. You're talented and strong-willed. You show great potential, but you are reckless and impatient. Your example has set in motion a chain of events that cannot be undone. We sent you to cleanse the river for the village, and you taint a young and open mind. You did this in our order's name. We cannot have renegades, never again. Not after Uzoma.
She was only selling some old fish she probably still had, Amana said defensively. She doesn't have any more, I'm sure. Why does it matter anyway? I can just tell her to stop. Amana trailed off as he caught Lata's expression. She was looking pointedly away from him.
You taught the villagers nothing,
Shikar said, his voice thick with disappointment.
We advised you to empower 3 so that your light can spread in them. But instead you've corrupted one of their youths. You have made them reliant on purity stones, which they lack the ability to create. In a few years, when the stones you dropped at the base of their river are finally dissolved away, what will they do then?
What should I have done? Amana shouted, unable to bear any more. Would you have had me stay there for the next 10 years, waiting for boys to grow into men just to rebuild a dam? He thundered as he leapt to his feet, slamming a furious fist on the stone table. Should I have boiled the putrid waters for every villager before filling their cups, or before every bath?
If that is what it took, yes,
Lata said at last. Amana stared at her. Somehow the softness in her voice quelled the fire kindling in his chest, even if only for a moment.
You are selfish, she whispered softly. We have always been aware of your faults. When it was just you, we hoped we could tame your wild side. We thought we could help you. I thought we could help you. I was wrong.
The elders stood up and walked away from him back toward the corridor. Wait! Amana cried out, desperately following after them. You can't leave me like this. Not after all I've done. Not when there's so much left for me to learn. The trio came to a halt on the edge of the plateau between 2 sets of stone stairways. One led up to the mountain's summit. The other led down a winding path through the mist.
We cannot teach you what you want to know, Lata said simply. I am truly sorry, Amana.
Wait, he begged, pulling the scroll of the 5 paths from inside his robes and placing it at her feet. Here, at least, Let me return this. I stole it, but I never read it. Let me do something right. Let me atone for something. Please, take it back. Lotta looked down at the scroll expressionlessly.
There are none here who need it. We know our paths. It is time you found yours.
Amana fell to his knees, too angry to argue, too guilty to plead. The light from the torches fell away, and a chill wind swept over the summit. Amana shivered as Vivek turned to leave.
One obsessed with the future lives too fully within the past,
he called over his shoulder. As he left, the night seemed to grow darker, and a dense fog filled the air. The sound of the elders' footsteps faded more quickly than they should have.
Remember, there are many paths to truth,
Shakar said kindly as he too vanished into the mist. Amana looked up to face Lata directly. Even on his knees, he was a finger's length taller, and now she looked him straight in the eye. Her expression softened, and she surveyed him as he had on the day they first met. As a light entered her kind old eyes, Amana thought she finally understood what Manali had meant when she told him he looked sad when he smiled.
The way forward is not always the way ahead,
she said, and on that enigmatic note she disappeared into the night. The fog had swallowed her whole. Amana collapsed on his back, unable to see anything above him, but mist. He couldn't say how long he lingered there. It felt like the end of his world. His eyes found the scroll on the ground beside him, and a fire rekindled within him. He would prove he could be taught. He would master the 5 paths. If the monks would not teach him, then he would find someone who could. Amana stared at the parchment in his hands, reminded of the annotation left on the ritual. Uzoma. Perhaps this lost one could complete his training properly. Perhaps the monks were right after all. There was more than one path to truth. The path in front of him was not the way ahead. Taking the scroll in hand, he rose to his feet and walked away from the summit. He started down the stone steps, which were illuminated by the now brilliant night sky above. He looked down the winding road that led to the base of Mount Junga. The way ahead was finally clear.
A note from the author. Thank you for reading A Servant's Work. This novella is my first published work, and I couldn't have picked a better way to make my debut. The chance to get in on the ground floor of the world Antoine Bandele is building was one I just couldn't pass up. Antoine placed a great deal of trust in me as I worked to help shape the backstory of Amana, the protagonist from the novel, The Kishi. For this opportunity, I shall always be very grateful. Amana was the anchor around which I crafted the various other characters, magical items, and locales. I'll be curious to see how many return as Antoine continues his exploration of Esowon and the surrounding territories. If you enjoyed A Servant's Work, please leave a review on your favorite retailer or social media.
Bandele Books presents A Servant's Work, Book 2 of the Lost Tales from Esowon series, written by Matthew Chatman, edited by Antoine Bandele. Read for you by John Rogers. We hope you've enjoyed this unabridged production of A Servant's Work, Book 2 of the Lost Tales from Esowon series, written by Matthew Chatman. Music provided by Kevin MacLeod and Incompetech.com under Creative Commons license. For more tales from Esowon, visit AntoineBandele.com for more information. This has been a Bandele Books presentation. All rights reserved. 2019. The end.